The Redemption of Babel, a devotional for the season of Lent, produced by Northside Church. Tuesday, February 28th. Our scripture passage today comes from 2 Kings chapter 17, verse 9, and verses 13 through 15.
The Israelites secretly did things against the Lord their God that were not right. From watchtower to fortified city, they built themselves high places in all their towns. The Lord warned Israel and Judah through all his prophets and seers. Turn from your evil ways. Observe my commands and decrees in accordance with the entire law that I commanded your ancestors to obey, and that I delivered to you through my servants, the prophets. But they would not listen, and were as stiff-necked as their ancestors who did not trust in the Lord their God. They rejected his decrees and the covenant he had made with their ancestors and the statutes he had warned them to keep. They followed worthless idols and themselves became worthless. They imitated the nations around them, although the Lord had ordered them, do not do as they do.
Whether hiding ourselves with fig branches from our God who walks in the garden, conspiring together to build a tower that reaches up to our God in heaven, or simply doing things in secret because we think God isn't paying attention, we have a tendency to operate out of our own lack. We forget to ask before we act. Use the following prayer prompts to start a conversation with the one who is always there.
Lord, when I lack confidence in your enduring love, remind me how you have forgiven me. When I lack belief that your name is more powerful than my own, help my unbelief. When I lack faith that you will do enough to care for me, give me eyes to see and ears to hear.
This week on the Dialogic Disciple podcast, we discussed the Tower of Babel and the reflections from this week. We've included a section of that podcast here today with Reverend Jeff Rogers. If you want to hear more of that conversation or any of our other episodes of the Dialogic Disciple podcast, you can look us up on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. That's Dialogic Disciple Podcast, Dialogic Disciple Podcast, produced by Northside Church. So for Ash Wednesday, we dove into the story of Cain and talked a little bit about the first city builder and how that city represented a rejection of God's protection and God's presence in Cain's life. And he names it after his son Enoch, which means inaugurate or initiate. And you can kind of see what Cain does there as an inauguration or an initiation of a whole new version of creation. So rather than a garden, Cain builds a city. And this, I think, the whole idea that we've been tracing here, that God plants gardens and people build cities, comes from these first 11 chapters of Genesis. And so we started with Cain, and now we're shifting toward the Tower of Babel and the story of Babel today. Jeff, you've recently read this story. Do you...
Deep personal reflection.
Right. As our guest here today, and as a trained theologian in the Word, tell us some of your what's going on. Tell us some of your initial thoughts on the story.
Okay, so I have two thoughts out of the gate about the Tower of Babel. First thought is, and it's not one of the more appealing thoughts, but I think it's being realistic, that this story was probably told as a way to explain the fact that there are many languages out in the world. That's just pretty popular in the way that ancient literature worked. There's a purpose to it. What's etiology?
Yep.
Is that what that's called?
Yeah.
I knew the word would come to me, so I was
Learned
like,
about that recently.
Yeah.
I was rambling for just a minute before I could think. I think there's a heavy etiology aspect to this story, and I think that shouldn't be discredited.
Sure.
I think we should recognize that, but it's not very fun to mine deep theological truths if you do that. But the other aspect of it is oftentimes this story is told as a way to say, oh, look at this human arrogance, and look at how God had to respond to the threat from these humans trying to reach heaven. But that's not the way the story is really written. Instead, these humans are like, I think we got this really cool idea, something we can do. And they start building this tower. And then it's as if God is up in the heavens, and he's like, oh wait, oh look at what those humans are doing. How cute.
Look at them.
Let us go down. That's what it
Yeah, I
says.
know, I love
That's
that.
the phrase that I really like in the story of the Tower of Babel, because it's not as if God was threatened
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
from God's self, that people might actually be able to become God.
Yeah. Yeah.
God was like, okay, like I'll see what this tower is. It's like, oh, that's really cute. You know, it's like if
it's
Carson, when Carson builds something out of magnetiles, he's like, look, we could live in this house. And I'm like, yeah, and here's a strong gust of wind that's going to knock it right over. But yeah, we'll live in there.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. It echoes what we see in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and then God is like, well, we better get them out of here and not let them eat from the tree of life. It's the same kind of thing. It's not a threat. It's more about, particularly here in the Babel story, it's more about, I think, a concern for the people.
Well, that's what I was just thinking about, because that in the Garden of Eden, it happens, and that's when we get that line about God walking in the cool of the evening, right?
Yeah.
They eat the fruit, and then all of a sudden God's like, oh, I don't know, you could read that as a let us go down, you know,
Yeah,
God's,
let's go take a look. What's going on?
What you doing, buddy? Where are you?
It's like we think we can get away with stuff, right?
Right.
Like as humans, and it's just on full display in my life and the kids. You know,
Yeah.
they're like they're looking back. They're like, maybe you didn't see me.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, we operate the same way. You know, we're like, oh, maybe I can just cheat a little bit here. I can just like cut in the line. I mean, if I steal that, it's not actually steal. It's just petty theft.
Right.
Wow. All right, Jeff, what you been doing?
All right, Jeff. So,
As long as you weren't wearing your Northside name tag.
It's on the way here.
So, I mean, I think that's exactly right. A lot of it has to do with how we rationalize, justify our behavior, and things like that. I do find it interesting, though, that so I have responses, I think, to both things that you said.
Sure.
I want to start. I want to put a pin in the language thing for just a second and come back to that. But let's start with a conversation about the motivation behind why these people are building the city in the first place. It says in the text that they're doing this so that they may make a name for themselves. And we all know that in the Hebrew Bible, name and naming things is very, very important. And again, I think this is firmly within the legacy of what Cain is trying to do when he names his first city after his son. One of the things that you said, Jeff, that struck me was that you said this is not about arrogance. And it's not about this. It's more about, we just got an idea. Let's just try this thing. Let's do this thing. And I do think there's some level of truth to that. I don't think it's ultimately arrogance that's going on here. But what I think motivates them is what motivated Cain to some degree, is that they have a fear of being forgotten, of being unprotected, of fear of being killed. And so they have a fear of being restless wanderers. Their ultimate fear is that they'll be scattered over the face of the whole earth, is what it says. And I think that fear is the underbelly of all arrogance.
Sure.
So, right? So when somebody is incredibly arrogant, or when a people are incredibly arrogant, it's generally because they have some underlying self-doubt or self-fear of something happening that's going to expose them. They don't want to be vulnerable. Arrogance being somewhat the opposite of vulnerability.
Yeah, I think maybe I said that it's not about arrogance. I was trying to say it's not about God being threatened by humanity.
Right.
It is. I do think there's it seems that this human pride is kind of at the center of this whole downward spiral that is Genesis 1 through 11.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
It just gets worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
Each story along the way, until this one that's kind of a whole city of folks that jump on board with this idea of arrogance or putting their name above the name of God.
Yeah.
But I think it highlights the disobedience too. James, you just mentioned, I think it's verse 4, right, where they say, let's go do this, right, let's build this tower. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the earth. Like they know, and then I thought that to me is in direct contrast with multiply and fill the earth, right? God has said, go multiply, fill the earth.
Yeah.
God has put you out there, he's put the mark on Cain, go, you're going to be protected. Like you're supposed to go multiply and fill this earth. That's what I've created you to do. And so this is the direct disobedience to that command. Oh, otherwise they know what's going to happen. God told us to scatter and multiply. We don't want that. We want to huddle together and protect ourselves.
Yeah.
Good power, right?
That's interesting to put it in conversation with that. Like it's a direct rejection of God's plan for humanity, right?
Yeah.
And that's kind of how we've been couching this whole conversation about cities in the first place, is that cities, particularly within these first 11 chapters of Genesis, but I think the argument can be made throughout all Scripture that cities represent a rejection of God, and not always, there are exceptions, but that cities in general are usually where people have huddled together and are in some kind of rebellion against God.